Okay, now we're going to look at alternative energy sources. In the previous lecture, we looked at sort of the conventional fossil fuel type of energy that's obviously dominant in the world. And in this part of the chapter, we're going to look at how alternative energy sources, some of what their benefits and drawbacks are, and some of the new things that are taking place in the alternative energy sector. I learned quite a bit out of this in terms of what's sort of, I mean, I knew about, wind farms and things like that, but I didn't know about some of the policies and then some of the things that are coming down the road, which we'll talk about near the end. So let's get started. There's several large sustainable energy sources that everybody knows about, and you can see these in the pictures. And as the population explodes, and we're heading towards 10 billion people on Earth, we're going to need um, alternative energy sources because at that rate, the fossil fuel depletion is going to be so fast. Like we mentioned in the last chapter, we got about 47 years left of oil. So it really we need to start thinking about these other types of energy. And some of them are, when we say renewable, meaning they're always there. Things like sunlight, wind, rain, tides, waves, geothermal, all of these, obviously depending on where you are, could be viable options to help start to really bridge the gap and start to offset the need for fossil fuels. Now, there are some environmental impacts to all of these, and we'll get into those as we go. But it's still, pound for pound, way better than, burning fossil fuels and creating greenhouse gases. And like I said, there are positives and there are a few negatives depending on who you ask in terms of these types of energy sources. The first renewable energy source we're going to look at is solar power. Solar power has been around quite a while. However, in many cases, it's been very prohibitive, but the cost of these has come way, way down. So, what is solar power? Solar power is where you can harness the sun's energy, either through thermal energy or through direct conversion from light into electricity. And we'll talk about how that works in the next slide. Solar thermal energy can be used to heat water systems. So sometimes in some urban areas, you'll have large buildings like skyscrapers with solar panels on top, excuse me, that help uh, heat water. It's a good that way you're not using gas or whatever to heat the water in the building. So what you see in the picture there on the left, those are photoelectric cells that convert light energy into electricity at the atomic level. And I'm going to explain that a little bit in very simple terms. The sun is always there. It rises every morning and sets every evening. Obviously, this is more viable in some areas than others, and we'll talk about the limitations in a couple slides. How does solar energy work? Well, in a nutshell, the sun has both thermal heat and light, and the light gets converted into electricity from these solar panels. And I'll explain that a bit more in a second. But if you had solar panels on your house, this is sort of what people do. So you have the sun's rays coming in, right? It the light from the sun gets sort of sucked into the solar panels, which then creates an electric current. Now that's direct current or DC current. So you need what's called an inverter to convert it to AC current or alternating current, which is what is in your plugs in your house. And then it goes out, you goes through a meter. And the idea behind this is if you install these on your house, you're kind of offsetting the amount of electricity that you need from the power company. So here's the power company's electricity coming into your house. All right. So they measure how much that you're using through that meter. But if you're using less because you have solar panels, that's how you can offset the costs. There's a couple of houses that I walk by, down by UWM that have solar panels on it, and I'm sure their electric bills are probably quite a bit lower because they're generating their own electricity. Now, how does this actually work? So, solar panels have two thin wafer layers that allow the electrons or the photons to go pass through in only one direction. And we're not going to go into all the nitty-gritty of this, but that's how it works. So, solar panels create a direct current, which is good for charging batteries and powering lights, but you can't use it for like to plug something in. That's what the inverter is for. So, if you look at this picture down here, the sun's light comes in here and it gets sort of trapped between these two slices, which only allows it to go in one direction. And what that does is that creates a current. Okay, and there's more science to this, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but the way the wafers are designed, it only allows the electrons to flow through one direction, and because of the materials that are in there, it creates a direct current, and that's how solar panels work. They're using the light from the sun to generate electricity. There are some limitations to solar power. Part of it is the initial cost. These can be quite expensive for the real good ones. Although the price has definitely gone down. Now the picture you see there on the right is a very cool picture. That's in Spain. So all of those solar panels are being directed right here at this middle section, which then boils water to create steam, which turns turbines, which then creates electricity. So that's a pretty, I like that photo. It's pretty cool looking. Um, like I was mentioning, the price of these is starting to come down, making it more affordable for even just local residents to uh, to have these on their houses. Now we'll get into that a bit later at the very end of this in terms of um, there are people who don't like those on the houses just for pure aesthetics or because it looks ugly. So we'll get into that later. What happens if the sun isn't shining? Well, that's a big issue, especially as you go towards the polar regions. They get less direct sunlight. So if you live in Arizona, where in the desert where it's hot and you get tons of sun all year long, these work great. But even in here in Wisconsin, we get a lot of cloudy days here. So you have to be able to surplus what you've on the sunny days, be able to hold that in, let's say, a battery that could be used later on. Now that technology is there, but it's not as efficient as it could be, and it's all still emerging in terms of being able to store that energy longer and more of it. It's kind of think of it like a hard drive on a computer, right? And I'm pretty old. I remember when hard drives were like megabytes. So now they're terabytes. Um, but so over time, the batteries will get more efficient. They'll be able to hold more, um, even with less and less sunlight. But right now, there are areas that are just limited just because they don't get a lot of sunlight. The other part of this is that the materials needed to make those wafers for the actual panels themselves, there are a lot of rare earth minerals that are used for that. And many of those are mined, what they call war minerals. They're mined in areas that are kind of tore up by civil war. And, you might have heard the term blood diamonds before. That means, there's a lot of strife and war and everything going on to see who controls all of those resources. But unfortunately, those are the only places to get these particular metals that are needed for these wafers. So there's a bit of a social injustice taking place in terms of how these materials are being collected. However, they're always looking into new and better ways to do this without the need of those rare earth minerals. That's why I have in there in the parentheses it says for now. So they're looking into other ways to utilize this technology with solar power without the need to have these types of minerals, because obviously it has to be mined, and things that are mined a lot of time oftentimes are not very helpful to the environment as well. The trucks and the fossil fuels burning to run the trucks and all that, and we've talked about this stuff over the course of the semester. So yeah, that's one of the downsides for that, but there's still much more positive coming out of this than negative. The next renewable energy source that's definitely being utilized and will probably be utilized a lot more in the future is wind power. There are, you've already seen these wind farms before. Uh, there's some up if you drive up 41 towards Oshkosh. There's a bunch all over the place now, um, and they're you know these work and they work a lot. The concept's been there for centuries. There was windmills in Denmark and things like that, but back then they used it for milling corn or wheat. But now, these wind farms are generating quite a bit of energy depending on where they are. Um, and the wind farms are not only just on land like you see in the picture here, but they're also at sea as well. Especially over in Europe, they're really big into the oceanic um, wind farms. How wind power works. So I didn't even put any words on this. It's a pretty simple design, so to speak. The the wind comes in and it turns this propeller, this turbine, which then spins and creates. This is a little generator here. So it's generating a current, and then that takes it and into the substation and then out through the power lines. So I mean these are pretty self-explanatory. They're not difficult. If you've ever been down by the port of Milwaukee, I believe is that the Coast Guard? I always forget whose wind turbine that is, but that thing's always spinning because that's how I go to work. And in fact, they've generated so much electricity began selling it because it's all that thing's always spinning. When they want to there are now wind studies that are done in order to figure out where these are placed, and they use GIS a lot for that, which is what I teach at UWM. So it's a very interesting concept. So there are places in this country that are always windy. If you've ever been out to the plain states, Texas or Nebraska, well, the panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma, it's always windy there because the wind's coming down off the Rockies and blowing across the plains. So there's a lot of areas out there that are very susceptible or to wind and would are very viable for wind farms, and they're being put up all over the place. Now, again, there's some limitations and some downsides to these as well, but overall, in general, they're a much better option, obviously, than fossil fuels. So here's some limitations. Now, before I say anything, if you could see the background image there, that's a wind farm out near Palm Springs, California. And I actually saw that. That one's been there a long time. I saw that in 1990. Yes, I'm old. I saw that in 1990 when I went out there to visit my uncle. So, California has a lot of people. If you don't know this, this country has roughly 330 million people in it. 10%, 30 some million people live in California. So one out of every 10 people that lives in this country lives in California. So they have a lot of issues with energy sources. They use a lot of power, a lot of water. I mean, everything's just on a much bigger scale in California because there's so many people. So this wind farm's been there forever, and they've put up tons of them out there, and they're starting to, they've made a big dent in the amount of coal that needs to be burned to fulfill the needs of all those people for energy. Anyway, so the limitations are again just like solar. The initial cost can be high, but those are dropping. Those turbines, the cost of the turbines are definitely going down. Um, it's like anything else, the initial stages of technology, were really expensive, and now, like TVs. TVs are a perfect example. You know, 15 years ago, of TV the size I have in my living room now would have cost like 3 grand, and now they're like $150 at Christmas time. Um, the magnets that the wind turbines require, um rare earth metals primarily mined in China. Okay, so that's another issue. China doesn't always adhere to environmental safe practices, although I guess they're getting a little better at it. But they've been under a lot of pressure from the rest of the world to clean up their act, so to speak. Because you got to remember that China is essentially going through their industrial revolution in the last 20, 30, 40 years. like we did back in the mid or the late 1800s, excuse me. Another uh, big issue for some people with wind farms is the turbines can kill birds and disrupt their migratory paths. And that's been an argument against these for quite a while, although that's waning, because as much as you hate to say it, that's a small price to pay to not have to burn fossil fuels. And then you have wind farms do produce noise and are ugly to many people. And we'll get into that a little bit again at the tail end, but there's an acronym called NIMBY, which means not in my backyard. And that a lot of people are like that. They agree with the technology, they just don't want to live near it. And that's an issue for a lot of things. Landfills are a big issue with that too. No one wants to put own a house next to a landfill. It's going to affect your property values and everything else. Another huge renewable source is hydropower. Um, Now this is the same concept as the wind turbine, except it uses water. So gravity, the gravity from the water just flows down and turns a turbine, which generates electricity. Same sort of thing. Now, this does require the construction of a dam, and in a place where water is dropping in elevation, then the water flows through a pipe that again turns the turbines. 90 Hydroelectric power is 90% efficient with zero emissions. So there are downsides, which we'll talk about in a second. But on the face, hydropower is hugely efficient and zero emissions. So it is a very, very viable way, a renewable way of making energy with doing very little to the at least atmosphere. We'll get to the other part in a second. So hydropower accounts for 80% of the renewable energy power in the US. So as many wind farms as there are, hydropower is still king when it comes to renewable energy sources in this country. So how does a dam work? Well, you have water that's sitting up here under gravity in what we call the head pond, the reservoir, if you will, and it comes down here under its own weight and then turns a generator. That generator generates electricity. That's why they call it a generator. Just like a wind turbine, except this is using the power of water. And then it takes that electricity and then pumps it back through the grid system. And then the water gets pushed out downriver. It's a very simple concept, but very efficient and very, very, it generates a lot of power. Um, I don't know the exact number, but you need quite a few wind turbines to to even come close to how much energy a dam can create. Geothermal is another renewable energy source where if you have certain areas of the world that have continuous amounts of heat being produced inside the earth, and you can use that heat, which generates steam, to turn turbines to generate electricity. Again, the same sort of process as the wind and the hydroelectric, but the wind uses air, the dams use water, this uses steam. So steam is brought to the surface through wells and then can be used to turn turbines. Now, Iceland and the Philippines lead the world with nearly 30% of their energy coming from geothermal sources. So you can see in that picture there, I believe that is Iceland, if I remember correctly. Now, the unfortunate reality is there aren't that many places on Earth that have geothermal energy. So, this is only an option if you have that available to you. Iceland is by far, I mean, that whole country is one big thermal generator, geothermal generator, that is. They have hot springs, mineral springs, geysers, volcanoes. It's a beautiful country if you've ever seen pictures of it. It's absolutely gorgeous. But they're committed to, in fact, I think Iceland, if I remember reading in the book, they're committed to try to become completely 100% um, fossil fuel free in the next 10, 15 years, something like that. Now they don't have a huge population and they have all of this available geothermal energy, so it's a little easier for them, but it's still a very good goal to work towards. So again, here's how geothermal works. You have steam here, that hot water that's in the ground naturally. It's just down there because you have all of this heat being generated from below. That hot water comes up, creates steam. That steam is then pumped under high pressure through a turbine, which creates in a generator, which creates electricity. Then the water is then cooled down and then put back into the ground to help recirculate it, to sort of like build the system back up. So it's a very efficient system in terms of, it's recycling its own waste. And I use that term loosely because waste just means it's already done with it. I'm not trying to make it a negative thing. It's just cooler water. And then the earth will heat it back up again. Very simple concept, but again, it's very limited on earth as to where you can do this. We also have biological fuels, which are fuels derived from any type of biomass, whether it's plant, algae, or animal waste. Feedstock material can be replenished readily, like corn, for example. We'll talk more about this as we go. It's biofuel is considered to be a source of renewable energy, unlike the fossil fuels. So you can see in the pictures here on the right, you have algae being grown that could be used for fuels to derive fuels. You have the corn, obviously, which we'll talk about in a second with ethanol. There are pluses and minuses to this, but in a sense, essentially what a biofuel is rather than extracting it from oil of some sort, you're extracting it from a plant or an algae. And this concept has been around for a while, but it's gotten more and more leverage in the last 30 years or so. By far the most common biofuel is derivative is ethanol. Ethanol is a ethyl alcohol, same type of alcohol found in your, alcoholic drinks, but it's being used in our fuel. It's often mostly used as motor fuel as an additive. The crops that grow this are take up more CO2 than what's released when it's burned. That was always one of the big sort of knocks on ethanol as well. You're still burning stuff, but the thing is all of that corn that's grown to produce the ethanol is sucking up more of this CO2 greenhouse gases than is being put back into it because the cars are burning cleaner. Now there are negative sides to this as well. So the positive is that you're using less and less oil, which is good because we're going to run out of it eventually. Those are non-renewable. The negative part is that we're growing more and more corn. I'm using corn as an example. More and more corn on more and more land strictly for this fuel additive rather than for food. So what that does is um, it it then negatively it affects the food prices. So everything becomes more expensive. We talked a bit about this a couple chapters ago or last chapter, I think, with agriculture, where once a food becomes super popular and in demand, the price goes up. Same thing applies with this. The ethanol has become sort of a cash cow for the corn farmers because it's needed in such great demand because there's so many cars. But the problem is then the corn derivatives that are not used for fuel, those prices go up, which like corn syrup and things like that, and then the prices go up from there. So that's a kind of a negative market aspect of it. Um, Now, one of the things that's pretty cool, and we'll talk a bit about this later, I believe, is that you can also use the wastes from the corn to do this, what they call cellulose um, generation or cellulose. So rather than the corn itself, you're using like the stalk and the leftover parts to create biofuels. So this is an emerging thing that they're working with to help create things like ethanol and methane. Biodiesel is another renewable resource that's made from a mix of things like recycled cooking oil, soybean oil, animal fats. It's clean burning and can be used in diesel engines without any type of modification, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. You'll see a lot of city buses like this, and it was the first advanced biofuel that was started being used here in the United States. And more, especially mass transit type vehicles are using it, pretty much required to use it now, which is not a bad thing. It's pretty much, very low emissions. It doesn't do much. And it now has created a situation where, for example, restaurants used to have to pay to get their oil like taken away, so to speak. I remember when I worked at a restaurant when I was a kid, we had to have that done. Um, and now with this type of situation going on, they'll take it for free because then they could take it, reuse it, and then sell it as a fuel. So it's created a situation where more and more things like cooking oils and stuff like that are being recycled. You also have biogas, is any type of biofuel that's naturally produced from the decomposition of organic matter or organic waste. So when things start to rot, they create gases, and those gases can be harnessed um, to produce things like methane and different types of fuel. And that allows you to, if you, because you're controlling that particular environment, you can actually then harness it for other things like to heat and to create electricity and things like that. So it happens. Just naturally from digestion, like cows produce a lot of methane. Um, so, and a lot of poop for and they take all of that and sort of create these biogases from it. And it's a renewable resource because you're always going to have cattle and you're always going to have all of this waste. And as long as you sort of do it in the right way, you'll have um, plenty of methane and carbon dioxide. Now you don't want to release and not only that, you're not releasing the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is being burned or um, uh, used for other types of things. It gets incorporated, so it's not just being released into the atmosphere. Another renewable resource that's being used in certain parts of the world is tidal energy or ocean power. Um, and this is a developing type thing, and there are some places that can utilize this and others that can't, obviously, depending on where you are. But it consists of three main types, sort of a stream generator. Think of that as like a kind of like a wind turbine, but for the ocean. So you have tides that come in and out, and as the tide comes in, it spins a propeller, which then turns it, generator, which makes electricity. And then when the tide goes out, it'll spin the other way and uh, turn and create the electricity. So that's one type of. You could see that up here, sort of these big turbines here. Another one is a barrage or sort of a dam that goes across tidal rivers, and at high tides and low tides, you can, have the water go through on either way as well. And then the final one is called a lagoon, which creates this huge, you have this big, large wall, so to speak, and what happens is the water comes in from the tide and sort of fills up that tidal lagoon. So as the water's coming in, the uh, the 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 water's turning the turbine, and then once the tide comes in, you can sort of shut it off, wait for the tide to go back out, and then let the water back out. And when the water's going out, it then turns the turbine in the other direction. So think of it kind of like a temporary dam where you're holding onto the water, you're letting the water come in, fill up, you hold on to it. When the water goes away again on the other side, then you let it out, and because of gravity, the water will generate more electricity going back out. Another type of renewable energy source is the ocean waves themselves. And there are parts of the world that are utilizing this. that they have lots of waves. There's prevailing winds that keep the water sort of choppy, at least a lot of the time, not always necessarily. And you can utilize this by having these sort of long tubes here. And when that go up and down and up and down, and as they have in there, there's generators within the body of those buoys that are generating electricity, and then they're stored in batteries. I'm not quite sure how it's transmitted, to be honest with you, but I would assume that it's stored in some type of battery system, and maybe there's an underground. There might be power lines or something that are run from those. But that's a pretty neat idea to utilize. I mean, the ocean is always in motion, so for the most part. Now, again, there are parts of the ocean that this may not be viable with in terms of, like the Gulf of Mexico, for example. It's nice and warm, but it doesn't get real big waves unless if you get storms out in there for some reason. It could be, just as smooth as glass, even though it's at a large body of water. And then there's other parts of the air world, and I believe this is somewhere in Europe, where they get winds all like the North Sea, for example. Um, they get crazy waves up there, 20, 30 foot waves. So this type of thing, I don't know, might break those, but they could utilize that fact. Another type of renewable energy is what's called a fuel cell. And it uses chemical energy of hydrogen or some other type of fuel to cleanly and efficiently produce electricity. Now, the beauty of these is they're very scalable. What that means is you can do something as large as a utility power station or something as small as a laptop computer. Now, what you have here is you have, in this case, hydrogen coming in, and based on the chemistry of this, you're going to have some heat given off, and you also have oxygen coming in on this side, and that chemical reaction in here creates an electric current. Now, the only byproduct of this is if you have oxygen and hydrogen, the byproduct is water. So that's, it's very clean and efficient. It's not producing waste other than water. You could probably drink that. It's probably distilled water. Probably doesn't taste very good, but and it gives off heat. But in the more important part is you're creating a very clean, efficient system for generating electricity. The last type of renewable energy we're going to talk about is nuclear energy. Now, nuclear is considered renewable, although you technically need to mine uranium to have a nuclear reactor because you need the fuel for it. And what it does is it uses splitting of atoms to turn heat into steam, just like, and then turns this a turbine, just like all of the other types of energy. But this one uses nuclear energy to do that. And there's 94 reactors in 28 states that generate 20% of the nation's electricity. So it's quite a bit actually. Um, Now the definitely the bonus of nuclear energy is the fact that there's zero carbon emissions. So because it's using uranium but not, fossil fuels. That's definitely the plus side of nuclear energy. The downside is obviously is there's, the potential for catastrophe, which we've already seen several times with Chernobyl and in Russia back in whatever the 80s, which was just devastating, and then now more recently Fukushima, when the tsunami hit the power plant, nuclear power plant in Japan. I mean, they're safe to a point, and but the other part of that too is there's the waste, the nuclear waste problem, which hasn't been solved. Where do you store all of this? Most of it's stored on site, and they're running out of space for that stuff. So, is nuclear energy the way to go for the future? Probably not, because again, uranium is fairly rare in the Earth's crust, and but it is technically a clean power source, at least from an emissions perspective. One of the things that we have to look for going forward is uh, getting away from what's called the traditional grid and looking more at a smart grid when you're trying to utilize more and more alternative energy. And let me explain that as we go here. So the idea is right now we have a power plant. They generate electricity. It goes into transmission wires, and those transmission wires eventually get into your house. So it's, point of sale, so to speak, right to the consumer. However, that doesn't work necessarily for renewable energy sources because you can have two-way interactions. Um, because there's it needs to be multi-directional over, and you could do this transcontinentally throughout the country. Um, well, like we mentioned earlier, a lot of the energy that's being created by alternative sources is direct current. So you could utilize that fact and push it around where it needs to go and invert it back to AC where it's needed, or you could resell it. You could do all kinds of things, but what we don't have right now is that interconnectedness with all of the different types of energy sources. And you can kind of see that in this image. It's not just about the power plant anymore because the power plant's not the sole producer of energy. You also have wind farms, you have solar panels, you have hydroelectric dams. And you need all of these to be interconnected in the sense that you can push and pull in different directions wherever the energy is needed to help offset. Um, the ultimate goal for this is to minimize and keep minimizing the amount of fossil fuels being used to generate electricity, which is mostly coal. So you can do that with things like smart buildings. So they have solar panels, or they have some type of usually solar panels that generate electricity, and then if they have more than they need, they can push that into the grid system as well, sometimes either as an energy credit or for profit, and it just goes around like that, and it keeps going like that. So there's a lot, rather than just having sort of this linear type of point of production, energy production to the consumer. You have this smart grid where things can go multi-directionals and over long distances. But in order to do a lot of this, you have to start implementing improved energy efficiency. Just switching the renewable resources isn't enough. And we've seen this, this has become more and more of a thing, especially since the 80s. When I had my first car still ran on leaded gas. It was at the very, very tail end of leaded gas, around 91, somewhere in there, 92. Um, so that was right when leaded gas was finally being completely phased out. Um, so it's not just about switching renewable resources. You have to improve the efficiency of our power sources now. And we've seen this. So you have like the Energy Star label that you see in the upper left corner there. And that's a common thing now with things like stoves and refrigerators and washers and dryers to show that, hey, these will work, but they will work in such a way that it will actually use less energy than prior versions of it. It's almost commonplace now, the Energy Star sticker. Things like LED bulbs. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was pretty much all fluorescent bulbs or incandescent bulbs. Then they phased in the compact fluorescent bulbs, the ones that look like little spirals. The problem with those is they have mercury. So they phased those out, and now we have these LED lights. In fact, I have one right in front of me producing the light for my face. Um, and those, while they cost a bit more right now, although the price of those has dropped way down, they last forever. They'll last for years now. Although, for some people, you still want that incandescent, that sort of soft light. So, things like that. And then the bottom picture there is what's called heat capture. So a lot of manufacturing plants, depending on what they're making, generate a lot of heat. So what some of them do is take that heat and convert it back into electricity to help offset their power needs. So if they're generating a lot of heat, it goes into a system that's ultimately probably has water in it, boils water, turns a turbine and a generator, and you get sort of this closed loop where they're generating heat, they generate some of their own power, and what that does is, again, the initial cost might be a bit more, but then over time, if you're generating your own power, you need less and less from the grid. Another big issue with going forward with the renewable energy, especially in rural and like developing nations, is just getting access to energy. There are a lot of places in this world that have no electricity whatsoever. Now, the image that you see there on the right is the Inga Dam in the Republic of Congo, which, when it's completely all done, will probably be the largest power station in the world. So in 2011, the UN uh, launched, launched, sorry, I got a typo there, launched the Sustainable Energy for All initiative to try to help get energy to everyone by 2030. And that mainly means electricity. So there's large scale solar projects taking place. There's large scale hydropower either proposed or being implemented. Now, hydropower has its own issues because, and we talked about this in a previous chapter, but the big downside to hydropower is the fact that usually there's a reservoir behind the dam, and that can sometimes displace families. However, the overall benefits, as long as that area can handle it, uh, really help that that particular dam that you see in the picture there, once completely online, will power much, not all, but much of Africa when it's done. That's how big that thing's going to be. It's going to be huge and generate a lot of power for a large area. Another huge factor going forward is our transportation and the need to increase efficiency all the way around. We mentioned that a bit in the biodiesels, right? So a lot of the city buses run on biodiesel now, which have super low emissions. But there's zillions of cars out there. I mean, look at our country alone. There's 330 million people. There's way more cars than that. I mean, my family has three. So there's a lot of people have multiple cars. I mean, there's a lot of cars out there, and trains and planes. Excuse me. Now, fuel efficiency has really, really gone up over the years, but it's plateaued since 1990. It hasn't really gotten much better since 1990. And if you read the book, part of that is because they really haven't been forced to create better fuel mileage. So the car companies are just kind of they're following the rules, but the rules haven't gotten any more stringent, so they're just staying where they are. There's a lot of politics involved in all that and everything as well, but if they're looking at making more stringent fuel efficiency rules, which will then force car makers to design cars to do that. You also have flex cars, the flex fuel thing that we saw earlier, where they run on essentially 85% ethanol gas um, from agricultural crops. Now, again, having a crop designated strictly for fuel is not the ultimate answer because it affects other things like food prices. However, that cellulose thing I was telling you about before, and I'll probably bring this up again, those are that's coming online more and more as we go along because there is so much of that food waste that could be converted back into biofuels. Now you'll see the three images on the left there, and I put those in there sort of in chronological order a little bit. So you have the Prius there up in the up, which was one of the real first success stories when it comes to hybrid vehicles was the Toyota Prius. And then in the middle, you have a Tesla. Now, I admit, I think the Teslas are pretty cool looking for, and I see them all the time. We have a Tesla charging station here in Oak Creek, and I see them once in a while. And I've told people for years that if they made a car that I could use exactly like the one I have now, and it's affordable but electric, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. Why wouldn't you? Who wants to keep putting gas in their car? But they don't have that yet. Now that's where the image on the bottom is. You know, That is a Ford F-150 electric truck. That's a prototype. It's not quite out yet, but you know, that those they're coming down the pike, and it's kind of cool actually because except for you mechanics out there, there's still going to be moving parts, right? You still gotta replace things. You just won't have as much of it as you did before in terms of all the combustion engines. I need an SUV for what I do. I have a drum set I got to carry around, and I have take sticks to the dump. I got to take stuff to the dump, and then I don't need a truck. I don't haul things per se, and I don't want my drum set sitting out in the elements. So I prefer, like, I right now I have a Ford Escape. So that's what I would prefer to have. So if they made an electric version that I can do all the things that I do now, I'm in. As long as it doesn't cost a fortune, I'm in. Now the problem is like the Tesla cars, they're not cheap. And you're buying in completely to their system. So you can think of Tesla sort of like Apple, right? Apple, when you buy an Apple product, you're buying into their entire world. You have to use their cords, their software, their applications, that's why I prefer Android, by the way. I don't like being in a closed system like that, but that's what Tesla is. You have to use their charging stations. You have to use their software. When you buy a Tesla, they have complete knowledge of all of diagnostics at any given time on your car. So they're tracking your car all the time. It's part of owning a Tesla. So if you don't want all of that, that's great, but that's personal preference. But they are pretty cool looking cars. We can't talk about implementing um, renewable resources and energy sources without talking about some of the barriers that are going to come with them. And there are some, and there's some that are just sort of perceived, and some that are actual, really there. And we'll talk about that as we go along. The first barrier to renewable resources is the fact that right now the system is heavily weighted towards the fossil fuels in terms of subsidies. And what that means is the government is giving out money to keep the price of things like gasoline artificially low. If it wasn't for the government subsidies, gas would be $3, $4 a gallon or more, maybe. The government is paying these people to keep the prices down to make our lives as consumers much easier. And the argument is if you lift these subsidies, obviously gas prices would shoot up at least a couple dollars a gallon, and that's going to hurt the economy. Now, I don't know if you remember, about 2, 3, 4 years ago, price of the gas the price of gas was around $3 a gallon. That sucked. I mean, nobody likes that. Um, I remember when I lived in St. Louis, getting my grad degree, that would have been 97, 98. Their gas was 89 cents a gallon. I spent $12 and filled my tank. It was great. Um, another argument for keeping the subsidies is the fact that fossil fuels account for more of the energy consumption and therefore should be subsidized more. It's a weighted thing. If it's doing more work, it should be subsidized more. But the problem with that is it doesn't take into account all of the external stuff that um, that happens with burning fossil fuels, like climate change, resource depletion, and increased global energy demand. I apologize. I got several typos in that one sentence. I apologize. I should have reread that. Um, so yeah, there's ancillary things or things on the side that burning fossil fuels does damage to that doesn't isn't being taken into account with those subsidies. And then finally, the subsidies reduce market competition, innovation, and the potential society benefits of renewables. What does that mean? Well, you only have one option. We use fossil fuels. If you made it easier for the other types of energy sources to become available, both from a user standpoint and from an investment standpoint, the price of those would start to even out, meaning it wouldn't be as expensive to run things off of solar or wind because the playing field is level. We see that around here in Milwaukee area, especially with cable, right? there aren't very many cable companies here. You have AT&T and T and you have Spectrum. That's pretty much it. So we're stuck with one or the other. And because of that, they can keep their prices up. I have Spectrum and it's way too much. I got rid of a bunch of stuff because it was irritating me. I'm sure you all can relate with that. Part of that is there's not enough competition for Spectrum. So they can keep their prices up because you really don't have any other choice. So that's what I mean by this. If they uh, reduce because of the reduced market competition, they can keep the prices. They get the subsidies because of that. If you took away the subsidies, you'd have more of a market comparison, and the prices would might go up a little bit, but they would stabilize after a while. That's how the market works. You also have economic and cultural barriers. Now, economic barriers include things like the very high initial costs of some of these, like um, uh, solar and wind power, hydroelectric dams. These things cost a lot to build, in the initial cost. But the cost savings over time is what you get out of it. But it's hard to tell an investor that. They want a return on their money. So this is where, again, kind of back to the market thing too. You want to create a return. If I'm investing money in a wind farm, I want to know when I'm going to get that money back and then make some. And if it's going to take 30 years to do that, it's not as attractive as, let's say, oil, which I can make my money back at in, say, 2 years. I'm making those numbers up, but that's sort of what it is. The fossil fuel market is a much more not only volatile, but it's much more profitable than is, let's say, wind farms, because that's a long, you know, long drawn out thing to get your money back. And because the power generation is based on fossil fuels, it's one directional. We talked about that in the slide. You have a coal-fired power plant, transmission lines, your house. There's no multi-directional infrastructure to compete with that. It's all based on the current structured grid. Now, there are some societal or cultural barriers, and I mentioned this earlier in a slide, this thing called NIMBY, or not in my backyard. There are some people that just don't want these things around them. Um, and this plays a role in the last bullet point there too. There are areas of the country that, if you live in an area with a homeowners association, excuse me, where they will just flat out tell you you can't have solar panels because they look ugly, because aesthetically they don't want it to be there, you know, and you're hindered by that. Let's say you want to put up solar panels to lower your electric bills because you're generating some of your own power. Well, there are areas that just won't allow you to do that. Now there are places there are laws being enacted that forbid that are saying, wait a minute, if somebody wants to use a renewable energy source, they have the right to do that, and it trumps your homeowners association. I don't know why that's so hard for me to say. Sorry, the homeowners association, and that's a good thing. Why would you want to ban something that's actually doing something good and positive for the environment? So, that's how this works, and hopefully, this will become more and more of a thing that, the prices of the initial prices will come down, and, the sort of those cultural attitudes will change. So, we talked about a few of the barriers. How do we overcome them? And this becomes more policy driven from the government, and both at the local, federal, and global scale. How do you start to change the attitudes to make a sustainable energy future? So, like I mentioned, in order to overcome some of these barriers, policy changes need to be made. I'm just going to kind of read these off here. The first and biggest one is stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Now, this is easier said than done, but in theory, it would reduce emissions because people, when you have gas that's at $1.80 a gallon, which is roughly where it is now, maybe $2 a gallon, people say, And I'm guilty. I'm just as guilty. Nah, I'm just gonna drive around, whatever. I got all this stuff to run around. They don't think about the fact that they're driving around. They just drive around. If gas is now $4 or $5 a gallon, now all of a sudden you're going to go, do I really need to go to the store for eggs, or can it wait until I need to buy more things? You know what I mean? Or making sure you plan out trips more. You'll have a tendency to do that, which then lowers emissions if you're not making as many trips. The problem with that, of course, is getting the politicians to enact that. I'm not saying I would like that. I mean, gas is a huge expense, especially if you have people that have to commute long distances to work. And then that doesn't even incorporate things like trucks that are moving, freight around the country. Diesel shoots through, if the price of diesel shoots through the roof, that cost is going to be then imparted onto the products that you buy in the store. So they're yes, it's cleaner for the environment, but it's going to hurt your pocketbook. But another thing that you could do is, rather than just subsidize the fossil fuel industry because it does account for more of the energy being produced, level the playing field a little bit by providing more subsidies that promote renewable energy. Um, that would make it more. That would make it more. What do you call it? It would make investors look at it as a better investment. It might spur innovation, spur expanding some of these renewable resources. Another thing is holding companies who damage the environment responsibly, financially responsible. Now this is pretty crazy. There are laws enacted that if you damage the environment while uh, creating an energy source that benefits the nation, for example, they're not on the hook for that. And that shouldn't be the case, but that's how the laws are written right now. It's pretty crazy. Read about that in the book a little bit. Um, Redirect some of the subsidies from fossil fuels to research and development. Now, there are massive subsidies for fossil fuels. We're talking close to $500 billion, if I read the book correctly. I think it was like $586 billion in subsidies. That's crazy. You take even a quarter of that and start putting it into researching better alternative energy sources, and we could start to, again, level that playing field, wean ourselves off of the fossil fuel industry. Now, there's no way right now you can just stop using fossil fuels. This entire the entire world would grind to a halt. What you need to do is incrementally start to change these types of things, little here, little there, and they've been doing that. But you have to do it that way for various reasons, especially just human buy-in. You know, um, it takes time to do this stuff. Lastly, reduce the lending rates to compensate for higher initial costs. What does that mean? Because wind farms and solar panels cost a lot of money in the initial setup, have the banks, a if you're going to do a project like this, allow the banks, or have the banks loan the money to do these renewable resources projects at a much lower interest rate, which makes it more less risky for investment purposes. That's a huge deal. That's a really, really big thing. Somebody has to pay for this stuff. And it looks more attractive to an investor if they know they're A, going to get their money back quicker, and B, because the interest rates are lower, they will get their money back quicker because there's less to pay back. So we're getting into this whole market thing. Again, these projects, both fossil fuel and alternative energy, take time and investment. And because of most of the subsidies are going to the fossil fuels, you need to have um, renewable energy get a larger portion of these subsidies. Like I said, if I remember correctly, in the book it was like 586 billion for fossil fuels and like 88 billion for renewable. That's a pretty heavily skewed uh, amount. So that makes, you definitely need to bring that back in line a little bit. Now that we talked about cap and trade a little bit a while back, and it could provide incentive. If you have companies that are willing to sell their energy sort of tickets on the market, that makes them money, and then it looks better to start investing, and it promotes it promotes utilizing renewable resources. And you'd have to go back to, I think, chapter 3, if I remember correctly, to look at what cap and trade is. But it actually works, and it promotes companies to invest more in renewable resources. Another big one is allowing private sector and institutional investors to invest in what are called green bonds. I had to look this one up. It's in the book. Basically, it's again sort of this pool of money at a lower interest rate, as long as that money is being used to for a renewable resource environmental type project. And why is that important? Because again, that high initial cost is not very conducive to getting investors. Investors want their money back. So this allows investors to look at a less risky investment because it's a bond specifically designed for this, and they know they're going to get their money back. It's stable, it's lower interest rate, and it makes getting these type of renewable projects done. And this has been going on now for, I believe, about 10, 15 years, and it's working quite well. Now, deregulating energy is another one that would promote competition. Going back to my cable example, you have two types of cable. Okay, answer this question. Where do you get your energy from? What's your electric bill? We Energies, right? That's it. That's the only place you can get your energy from. They are basically a monopoly here in southeast Wisconsin. Okay, that's just the way it is. So if you deregulate the energy, what you're doing is decoupling the people who create the actual electricity itself, like at the power plants, from the people who distribute it. And what that does is gives consumer more options for where they actually get their energy. So if you decouple right now, we have the power plant right here in Oak Creek. That's a We Energy power plant. So they're making the power and they're distributing the power to all the houses. If you made those two separate entities, so let's say We Energies still keeps the power plant, and we'll say um, company B is the people running the distribution. Now you have that. If you do that all over the place, let's say I live in Madison, or I live in somewhere in between Madison and Milwaukee. We'll say Oconomowoc. I live in Oconomowoc, and I want to utilize some solar panels. Well, I can get my energy from We Energies, or I can get it from these people over here that are using renewable sources. It promotes things like wind farms and solar panels, because then it gives the end users, the consumers, us, options as to where we get our energy from. Because energy produced by renewable resources, by definition, is going to be cheaper because there's not as much overhead. You don't need all the coal and all the, you have some wind turbines, and they run all, not all the time, but a lot. So giving consumers options creates a market-driven price, and not an artificially lowered price. So how do we assess all of this, going forward? We need to develop strategies to increase renewable energy by a specific year, which they've been doing. So the countries, I mentioned this earlier with Iceland, they set a target date and say we're going to be 100% carbon free by 2040 or 2030 or 2050 or whatever it is. You got to give yourself enough time, but you still have a goal. You have a number that you're working towards. And this is being done all over the all over the world and in the United States. There are cities that are going, that have said, okay, we're going to try to go completely green, renewable by a specific date. Another aspect of this is a full life cycle analysis needs to be done on renewable energy or transportation. What does that mean? So you're looking at it from beginning to end. What are all of the effects and causes of this, sort of modeling all of the best and worst case possibilities, and how it affects not only the environment but also society as well. So are you going to have a lot of people rise up and go, not in my backyard? That is an issue. That's something that has to be taken into account. Again, That happens with mines, that happens with landfills, things like that all the time. So how do you look at it from sort of this entire system and sort of try to model every scenario and every from every perspective to gain the positives and negatives to see if hopefully there's more positives than negatives. Now, no energy source is perfect, and there's always room for improvement. Um, like we said, even with the wind farm, there's noise issues and then the bird issues. And solar panels, a lot of people just think because they look ugly, so it's just an aesthetic. But those types of renewable resources are being developed all the time, and they're getting better and better and better and more efficient to the point where someday you might be able to have a 1 foot square section of solar panel, which doesn't take up a lot of room, generate like half the electricity in your house. It could come to that point eventually, as the technology gets better and better. And then, as society understands, hey, we need to start thinking about this, you'll get more and more people to buy into it. And that's always the hardest part is the buy-in, not only from the consumer, but from also the government and the legislators. You have people that have special interests, right? And whatever it is, it could be corn, oil, you know, whatever it is, they want to sort of make sure that their guy is taken care of. And it's hard sometimes to push these renewable projects when it's pushing out something that's made people money for the last 100 years. So it's hard, but it is slowly changing. The transition is underway, however. You'll see more and more wind farms and solar panels as you go forward because we have to. I mean, we just have to. I'm a geologist. A lot of our students work for oil companies, but you have to be realistic and know that at some point the oil is going to run out with 10 billion people on this planet by 2030 or whatever the projections are. You have to start weaning off of the fossil fuels. It won't happen overnight, and hopefully over time people will come up with more and more innovative ways of making that transition. But there have been studies done that if you have market-driven prices and societal buy-ins, one of the other things about this that I mentioned in the second bullet point there is that they did a study that the jobs in general in the renewable resource sector, like wind farms, solar panels, are in general higher paying than the solar, or excuse me, than the fossil fuel side of that. So the jobs that it's creating pay well and pay better. So, that's also a bonus because people will want to work for these companies. So, obviously a huge overriding factor in this is climate change. We need to get away from the fossil fuels because the cascade effects of climate change could vastly alter our way of life in terms of sea level rise and everything else. Um, so that's why these renewable resources are so important to start bringing up, so to speak. And that sector, the renewable resource sector, is one of the fastest growing in the country. Well, I definitely learned some things in this chapter. I knew about wind farms and solar panels, but like the policy stuff, I didn't. It was a bit of an eye opener in terms of the subsidies and everything else. Again, I fill my gas tank just like everybody else, and I don't want to pay $5 a gallon. But you have to at some point understand that that model is not sustainable. However, if we can at least level the playing field a little bit and bring more and more renewable resources online, that sort of bite into our wallets won't be as hard to take down the road. But it is a bite we're all going to have to take eventually. We need to start thinking about utilizing more renewable resources down the road. All right, that's it. I know this one's a little late. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.